Hello, this is Ann Gritch, and we are here with Jim Purcell talking about it's another segment of the oral history of the Diocese of San Jose. So Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Ann.
You were born and raised in San Francisco, the Archdiocese of San Francisco. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, early childhood, growing up in San Francisco?
Sure. We grew up in what is now known as the Haight-Ashbury, but in those days it was known as St. Agnes Parish.
Right.
And in fact, when I was thinking about my early connections to the Diocese of San Jose, I realized that one of the first was the Presentation Sisters, because they taught me at St. Agnes Grammar School. And my mom and dad raised 9 of us. It was a multicultural family. My mother's Lebanese and my father is Irish. My mother spoke 3 languages. She was born and raised on the Mexico-United States border in Nogales, Arizona. And so early on, I was exposed to a variety of cultures, which I've come to appreciate more deeply in my old age.
I can imagine.
I went to high school at St. Ignatius High School, which then brought me in contact with another religious order that has deep roots in the Diocese of San Jose, the Jesuits. And from St. Ignatius, I went on to St. Joseph's Minor Seminary in Mountain View.
Down the peninsula.
Way down the peninsula. There's nobody more parochial than somebody born and raised in San Francisco.
Isn't it true? I was born and raised in San Francisco, so I know of what you speak.
So geographically, my first real contact with the diocese, before it was the Diocese of San Jose, was St. Joseph's in Mountain View. I was there for 2 years. And then I went to St. Patrick's in Menlo Park. And during those times when I went to St. Joseph's, one of my classmates was Father John Sandersfeld. And of course I didn't know at the time, and neither did he, that someday he would be a member of the Diocese of San Jose. Father Mike Mitchell was a year ahead of me. Father Bob Moran, Father Terry Sullivan, Father Dan Derry were all in the seminary when I was there. So all of these relationships came back for me when I did end up here geographically many years later. But after 2 years at St. Patrick's, I was sent to Rome during the same 4 years as the Second Vatican Council. And it was a magical time. I was living at the North American College, studying with the Jesuits at the Gregorian University. And many of our professors were Paridi at the council. So it was an extraordinary time.
Just excitement, just new, I can imagine. Yeah.
I came back home in July of 1966 and was assigned as a parish priest in Novato at Our Lady of Loretto. And one of my altar boys was Father Larry Hendel. So the connections to San Jose have kind of woven themselves into my life serendipitously. When I decided to resign from active ministry, I went to work for Catholic Charities in San Francisco. And in 1974, I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to Catholic University for a master's in social work through Catholic Charities. But before that, my major project with Catholic Social Service in San Francisco was to work with the Mission Deanery. And the dean was Monsignor John Dwyer. So another connection to the Diocese of San Jose down the line. And John Sandersfeld was a parochial vicar at Mission Dolores. So I worked very closely with the 2 of them and other priests in the Mission Deanery.
What kinds of work were you doing? Community
My job was to help the parishes develop programs that could serve the broader community. So one of the first things we did, and John Sandersfeld was a huge leader in this, was 10 parishes agreed to collaborate to put on what we called the Summer of Love program, which was a summer program for young children, mostly recreational programs, but using parish facilities. And we had 10 parishes, and the Mission Deanery in those days was kind of the people of color crescent of San Francisco. So it was the Mission District, the Outer Mission, Bayview Hunters Point, and Visitation Valley. It was a very exciting time to be working directly with parishes through Catholic Social Service.
I can imagine. I can imagine.
So then I got my master's in social work with a specialty in group and family therapy, group process. Came back and ended up with Catholic Social Service again in San Francisco, but was living in Palo Alto.
Oh,
And my pastor there was Father Gene Dillon.
another connection.
Another connection. My wife and I lived there for 4 years. And we attended St. Anne's when Gene was the pastor there. Going back even further, and I'm not sure of the exact dates of this, but my mother was on the San Francisco Archdiocesan School Board when Bishop Dumaine was assistant superintendent. So they knew each other,
Sure.
which is a happy coincidence as well. So that's my kind of early years before I actually moved to the Valley of Heart's Delight.
And how did that happen? Because you were in San Mateo, is that right, when you were working with Catholic Social Service?
Actually, it was before San Mateo.
Oh.
What happened was in 1977, Helen Hansen, who was the director of Catholic Social Service, known as Catholic Social Service in those days, for Santa Clara County, hired me as her director of counseling.
Oh,
And so I was there for 2 years, and then Monsignor Tim O'Brien, another connection to the diocese, who was the director of Catholic Charities at that time for the Archdiocese, asked me to serve as interim director in San Mateo County, which had its own Catholic Social Service. And I agreed to do that on the condition that I could apply for the permanent job when they went through their search process. And I was
Sure
fortunate enough to be selected as the director there. So I was there for 4 years. And that would have overlapped the time when San Jose became its own diocese.
now do you remember, what was the kind of feeling now in San Mateo, or actually in the Archdiocese, when we became a diocese? The announcement was made in January of 1981.
You know, when I think back on it, my wife and I at the time were living in Fremont, in the Oakland diocese.
All right.
And we were very involved in St. Joseph's Parish over there, and she was actually a religious education, faith formation director there. So I wasn't too aware of, at the parish level, the dynamics of the change. But I was very aware that Helen Hansen became a director of Catholic Charities and was on a peer, and therefore a peer with all the other directors throughout the country.
Wow.
And having worked for Helen, I was certainly very proud for her and for the diocese. And I had known, I was delighted that Bishop Dumaine was appointed as the first bishop of the diocese. But I really didn't have a whole lot of contact with the priests of the diocese at that time.
Even the ones that you had gone to school with?
Even John. I had kept in touch with John Sandersfeld, and our friendship has grown over the years. But for the most part, no.
So after San Mateo County, you wound up in San Jose.
I did. Helen decided to retire after, I don't remember, 23 years or so.
Yeah, she was quite an icon.
She was. In fact, I recall a number of times in meetings when Bishop Dumaine would refer to her as the real Bishop of San Jose.
That sounds like our bishop,
Yes. But Helen retired, and I was asked to apply for the position, which I did, and was fortunate enough in 1983, so 2 years after the diocese had been formed, to become the director of Catholic Charities for San Jose.
Were you still living in the Diocese of Oakland?
We were, yes. We lived in Fremont until about 11 years ago.
Of course, it was an easier commute in those days.
Much. Well, at the beginning it was. At the end it was.
I'm sure not. So tell me about Catholic Charities when you took over, and what happened. How did it expand?
Well, it was a tremendous organization. Helen had built an unbelievable foundation over the years. One of the things she did, which is certainly very relevant for today, she was one of the first directors in the country, I believe, and I know for sure in the state of California, to get the county to help fund immigration counseling services.
Wow.
And in 1986 was the last time Congress passed a Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act,
1986.
1986. And when that happened,
30 plus years.
yes, when that happened, we had to double the size of our counseling program overnight, our immigration
Oh, I
counseling
can
program.
imagine. How did you do that?
Well, again, serendipity and the guidance of God's Spirit. Santa Clara University had just started what it called the East Side Project,
Uh-huh.
which was a program to recruit student volunteers to work in the community as volunteers.
Mhm.
Not so much to give them volunteer experience, although that was important, but rather to bring them in contact with the poor
Mhm.
and to learn from the poor.
Mhm. Almost like an internship.
Right. The three Jesuits that started that program were Father Dan Gurman,
Mm-hmm.
Father Steve Brevet,
Mhm.
and Father Sonny Manuel.
All right.
Dan was the
Giants.
one I worked with the most,
Ah,
and he became a volunteer himself in the program. We rented space on Monterey Road. We doubled the size of our program overnight, mostly with those volunteers. And I still have vivid memories of listening to stories of some of those immigrants who had come into this country undocumented and who now saw this ray of hope for the future, and most of all for the future of their children. I also had the great fortune, as Helen had started a very strong program for the elderly. And one of our sites was the John the 23rd Senior Center.
in downtown?
In downtown,
Uh-huh.
the old Newman Center,
Oh.
where Larry Largenti was,
That's
and
right.
where there's
Side
now,
Beach had been there.
yes, and now there's affordable housing there that
Good.
the diocese helped
Yeah. Mhm.
put in there. But when I took over John the 23rd, or when I took over as director, the building itself was in badly needed renovation. And my director of aging, Dee Wishman, who later became director of Catholic Charities,
Mhm.
developed a committee of staff and seniors to plan the renovation. And one of my memories of that was she came to me with the plans, and there was a new room in the building that was designated as a beauty parlor. And I said, Dee,
We don't do this.
we cannot afford to put a beauty parlor in our senior center. I'm, of course, very budget conscious.
Right.
And she explained to me that one of the things that's most precious to female seniors is their ability to get their hair done at their hairdresser. And it wasn't until I thought of my own mother
Uh-huh.
and that weekly or semi-weekly visit to the hairdresser and what that meant to her that I realized what Dee was saying.
Mhm.
And so sure enough, we
You
had
funded it.
a chair. Well, we had a single chair,
Uh-huh.
but they used volunteers to come in and help the women with their hairs. And it was just
It's
a
wonderful
great
story.
a great example of the importance of listening to people who know more than you do about what's going on. We also built the East Side Center
Yeah.
during my time there.
Uh-huh.
That was my first construction project.
And it's Allen Rock?
Allen Rock, yep.
St. John Vianney Parish.
Right,
Yeah.
and right near a senior housing complex.
And that's still going.
Still going strong. It
That's
is.
great. That was wonderful.
We started the Caritas Society when I was director of Catholic Charities.
Can you talk a little bit about that, the Caritas? 'Cause they do some wonderful work.
They do. It's actually a replication of something that Monsignor O'Brien started in San Francisco called the Ring of Charity.
Ah,
And I approached Bishop Dumaine and suggested that this could be a great way to raise additional resources for Catholic Charities. He was fully supportive of it. And there were three women, Angelina Boitano, Marjorie Pierce, who from the Mercury News, and Andrea Thomas. Andrea is still with us.
She's everywhere. She's
The other two,
marvelous.
unfortunately, are not.
Ah,
But they were the force behind starting this. And some of the early supporters were Mike and Mary Ellen Fox, the Sobratos. And it was my first real venture into what's called major gift fundraising. And it was a lot of fun to do. So in those days, Catholic Charities still received a lot of its funding from government entities.
ah.
The
Is that still the case or no?
Well, it's not as much,
Much.
but it's significant. And in those days, we had one of the largest refugee resettlement programs in the country, mostly Vietnamese. That's now even more diverse in terms of countries of origin than it was then. We had a large program for the chronically mentally ill funded by the county. We had the seniors programs, and then we also had what I used to call families in crisis, mostly counseling, family counseling programs.
Connections then with the Chancery. Bishop Dumaine was always very supportive, I know, of Catholic Charities.
Right.
Or of, yes, of your work. Other connections there, or?
A little bit of connection with Father Mitchell, sometimes on financial stuff.
Sure.
Although Catholic Charities had its own separate budget and its own separate board. But for the most part, Bishop Dumaine was a strong believer in delegating, and we had a board of directors, which he was a member of, and I reported to him on a regular basis. In fact, the way I became, as you know, my next job was development director for the diocese, and if you're interested, I can tell you the story of how that came about.
I would love to hear that.
Well, because I was a member or director of Catholic Charities, I was on the Bishop's Administrative Committee.
Right, the BAC.
The BAC. And one day after that BAC meeting, I was chatting with the bishop, and I said to him rather directly, you know, Pierre, I called him Pierre by then, the way we raise money from Catholics in the diocese is not very smart. And he looked at me.
I can imagine.
What do you mean? And I said, well, imagine yourself as a relatively wealthy Catholic in the pew. You've got the pastor pounding on your front door. You're trying to get in through the back door with the annual diocesan appeal. I'm trying to get in through the mailbox with the Catholic Charities appeal. And if they have a child at Midi High School, your high school, the high school is also after them. I said, at best, they're confused, and at worst, they're angry and upset. Yeah. And in his own inimitable fashion, he said, well, what would you do about it? So I said, I think what I would do is I would create a position that reports directly to you that would try to coordinate, not control, but coordinate fundraising with major gift individuals from those four entities. And a few months later, he came into a BAC meeting and said he had decided to create a new position in the diocese, and then pulled me aside after the meeting and said, I'd be a lot more comfortable if you took this job. So having put my mouth out there, I thought only in fairness to him, so I did.
Were you sorry to leave Catholic Charities?
It was with mixed emotions that I left. I loved the interaction with the clients. We had a tremendous staff there of people, and it was a very fulfilling job. But I also felt very committed to Pierre and what he was doing as the leader of our diocese, and thought that if he could use my talents in that way, then I would accept the job.
Oh, we're glad you did. Now, was it at this time when you started to work with then Father John Sandersfeld and the Jack lawyer?
Actually, there was a little bit before. It was while I was still at Catholic Charities. John was vicar for clergy or vicar for personnel. I forget his.
He was vicar for clergy.
Okay.
But he had personnel came under him.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would see him periodically in the chancery, and John knew that I had some formal training as a group facilitator. So he engaged this consultant, Jack Lawyer, who brought a team to facilitate one of the clergy days in the 80s. I don't remember the exact year. And I was invited to be a member of the team. So that was my first, what I would say, formal interaction with the clergy as a presbyterate in the diocese. I had, as director of charities, I had worked with some parishes, particularly with the counseling program. We had one of our counseling sites was at St. Mary's in Gilroy, on the parish grounds there. But as a presbyterate, that was my first time. It was a tremendous experience.
Was it?
Yeah, it really was.
So
And then, no, I'm sorry. As Director of Development, of course, one of my assignments was to help resurrect the campaign for the renovation of the cathedral.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the cathedral.
The bishop had decided that it wasn't a basilica then, but that St. Joseph's in downtown San Jose deserved to be renovated because it was an architectural gem, which it is.
It is, yeah.
And the art inside of it is also tremendous. Unfortunately, they decided on a goal before they opened a wall. And in any kind of a major renovation project like that, the target keeps moving.
Sure.
And so the fundraising campaign got off to a rocky start. And in fact, 6 months after I was in the job of Director of Development, I went to the bishop and I said, this is a resurrection that is not going to happen. Meaning that we weren't going to be able to raise the complete goal that would be needed to fund the renovation.
Well, the renovation was 3+ years.
It was
a long time.
It was, and a lot of people at the time did not appreciate the magnitude of what was involved. I can tell you, if you have the time, I can tell you a couple of stories related to the renovation.
Because I was involved peripherally in that, so tell us the story.
Well, one of my favorite things to do in terms of fundraising was to tour people into the cathedral during the actual renovation. And they had scaffolding from the floor to the top of the dome, inside, with an elevator. And so you were able to get up close to the art restoration that was being done in that dome. Well, one of the former pastors of the cathedral is Father Joe Dondero, Jesuit, because at one time the cathedral was a Jesuit parish.
Yeah, and it was at the time that
when the renovation started, that's right. So Joe had retired and he was living up in Los Gatos at the retirement center, and he's John Sandersfeld's uncle.
Ah, I didn't know that.
So I said to John one day, I said, by the way, I said, has your uncle ever visited the cathedral? He says, I don't think so. So Joe was larger than John in terms of height. And,
big man.
And really big man. So I went up to visit him, partly because I wanted to get some history of the cathedral for my fundraising. And I invited him, and he said, sure, he'd love to come down. We get him in there, we go up the elevator, we're touring the restoration, and it's time to come back down, and the elevator won't work.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
This man is about 6'5", about 260 pounds.
And he's up.
And we're up there stuck. So I said, Joe, we're going to have to wait until, he said, no, we don't have to wait. We can go down there's a metal staircase. I said, Joe, he's got a cane. So now you hold my cane. So I said, okay, I'll go first. And I'm thinking, if this guy falls, it is the end of me. It took about 20 minutes to get down, but he never hesitated. It was amazing. And, and so that's...
It's a good thing you weren't afraid of heights.
Yes. Another tour I did was with Dr. Ramon Jimenez. I don't know if you know that name. He was an orthopedic surgeon. His wife, Anne, and his mother, Louise. And and Ramon and Anne were the donor prospects, to use fundraising language, but he wanted his mother to come because she had been involved in the cathedral as a parishioner.
All right.
So as we're walking around, she's telling me some stories of her history, and so I asked her, I said, would you mind if I came and visited you and listened to your stories of your life in the cathedral? And so I did with her what you're doing with me. And I actually have a copy of that I'm going to get to you. I got permission to share it with you.
Oh, that is grand.
But this is a woman who, at the time she was in her 70s, she's passed now, came from Guadalajara, Mexico to Hollister with her family, and told me that when they were children, they used to refer to St. Joseph's as La Catedral.
La Catedral.
Even in those days, for the Spanish community, it was known as the cathedral.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. So it was very special.
Oh, I can imagine.
And then my third story with the cathedral was the actual dedication. And I don't know if you remember
Oh,
that.
do I remember that?
But we had the San Jose Symphony
Yes.
playing in the cathedral. And it was that was another new learning for me in terms of negotiating that whole thing. But it turned out to be a glorious celebration.
Well, remember, we had the final mass at St. Patrick's.
Exactly.
And the bagpipers led
And
us
the procession,
down the
yes.
procession, and then went down Santa Clara. When we turned into Market Street, we were met by the mariachis.
Exactly.
It was
Yes,
glorious.
it was.
Yeah.
And then we had a little celebration outside
Yes.
the cathedral after the mass, and I saw he just died, sadly. John Popovich,
Oh.
who had worked with the city of San Jose,
Yes.
was very helpful to me, figuring out how to close Market Street and all that
Oh,
good stuff.
It was.
But it was a wonderful celebration, and that's when I knew, that liturgy, and then the performance of the symphony, when I knew that it was worth every dollar to restore that building.
It is a jewel.
Yeah.
It is a jewel, absolutely. Now, Mike and Mary Ellen Fox were also very much involved.
They were, Mike was the chair of the fundraising committee.
Okay.
They were very supportive of Bishop Dumaine.
That is great, that is wonderful. What about Mateo Sheedy, another friend of yours?
So I first got to know Mateo when he was John's parochial vicar at Most Holy Trinity. And I had facilitated some staff meetings for John, even back to when I was at Catholic Charities, and Mateo was there. And then Mateo became pastor of Sacred Heart, and I got to know him there. Of course, he did a great job there of making that parish a service to the poor and the Hispanic community. Was tremendous. I didn't interact again with Mateo for a while until I was at Santa Clara University, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later.
Okay.
But one of the other things happened while I was director of development, because my office was in the Chancery, was the 1989 earthquake.
Yes.
And as you remember, it happened at about 5:04 in the afternoon. I was one of those in charge of getting the Chancery evacuated. Fortunately, we didn't have a lot of structural damage, but we had computers on the floor, and we had cracks in ceilings, and we had plaster falling.
And we had people worried about their kids in school
Exactly.
and families.
Exactly. And so the next day, I can't remember whether it was Mitch or somebody else put together crisis teams to go out, and I know one team went to Notre Dame High School, which had some severe damage. I was on the team that went to Sacred Heart Parish, where Mateo was. And when I got there, I could see the church tower leaning into the street. And I said to the parish, has anybody called the city and the police? Because that sidewalk needs to be cordoned off. And so they did, and we got the proper city authorities, Department of Public Works and so forth, to make it a safer place. And then, of course, Mateo had to do the campaign to renovate the church, and his dear friend Murphy Sabatino was involved with that.
Yes, indeed.
And my wife and I, Ernie, are proud donors at a modest level to the renovation of Sacred Heart. But we were in the room when they had the event, I think it was at the Italian Gardens, where Murphy said he wasn't letting anybody out the door until they wrote a check.
I was there, and I had my checkbook.
There you go. So those are very fond memories.
They really are.
Of my time as director of
Oh, I can
development.
imagine. You know, when you mentioned the '89 earthquake, I was working in the worship office at the time, and about half of the presbyterate was on retreat at El Retiro. So we had just finished evening prayer when it happened, and it was very interesting to me to watch the fathers, particularly the pastors, who had schools in their parishes. Like, okay, the kids should be okay. It was very moving,
Yeah.
and most of them left
Yeah.
just to go back and be with their people.
Yeah.
It was
Sure.
quite something.
Yeah.
It really was. So,
One other story,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
No,
when
stories are
I was director
good.
of development, I forgot about this one. I had, as part of my job as Director of Development, I had encouraged, and the bishop supported this, and so did Father Mitchell, a more formal development of planned giving, or encouraging people to remember the diocese and their parish and Midi High School in their estate plan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one day I got a call out of the blue from Monsignor Nor Allen, who was the pastor of St. Christopher's at the time, and he said, "Jim, I need your help." I said, "Sure, Nor." Nor was one of my heroes. I loved him. He said, "I have a parishioner who wants to leave her estate to the church." And I said, "Gee, Nor, that's terrific." He says, "Yeah, but there's a problem." He said, "She doesn't like lawyers and she doesn't like financial planners.
Oh dear.
Would you go talk to her?" So I said, "Sure." So she lives in this simple little parish in our house in Willow Glen. She's a spinster, never married, retired school teacher, has an estate of $1.5 million, and says she wants to leave half of it to the diocese and half of it to the Jesuits for seminary formation. I said, "Eleanor, that's wonderful, but you need to have a will to make that happen, and to have a will you need to have an attorney." She said, "Well, I don't like attorneys." I said, "I know, but I can't, I have a conflict of interest here. I can't do it, and I'm not an attorney." She said, "Well, I'll only talk to an attorney if he'll come to my house."
We can make that happen.
I said, "I'll find 3 attorneys, you interview them, and you pick one." And fortunately, I had, from my days at Catholic Charities, a list of attorneys, Catholic attorneys, and found 3 who would be willing to make a home visit. She picked one. He was terrific. Owen Fiore was his name. He created the legal documents, and in creating her trust, she wanted to name the bishop as her executor. And I said, "Eleanor, that's not a good idea, because you're leaving half of your estate, in effect, to the bishop at the diocese." She said, "I won't do it if I can't leave them."
Oh dear.
So I went to Pierre and I said, "Pierre, I know this isn't ideal. I've talked to the attorney. The attorney says you can do this. So we got to do it." So he agreed. We get all the documents signed. 10 days later, she has a stroke, and she's incapacitated. And we have an advanced directive too for healthcare. He's the person on that too.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
So he immediately resigns everything and appoints me as the delegate. And I quickly learned what the word trustee means. Fortunately, I was able to get, after she was out of the hospital, we got Eleanor back home for about 2 months with 24-hour care. She was able to, and then she passed away, and then I had to administer the estate, which was a tremendous learning experience for me. I'd never had to do that before. And as I say, I learned the meaning of trustee, because one of the things she did was she had a safe deposit box. And when I opened the box, there was $10,000 in cash in there.
Oh my.
It's just a typical old-fashioned way of keeping your money, you know. Anyway, it ended up with the diocese getting a wonderful endowment for seminary formation, and the Jesuits getting the same. So, and only because Monsignor Allen had that relationship with her.
Yeah. But how creative you were to say, "I'll get 3 attorneys and you can." I wonder how the other 2 felt who weren't picked.
They were fine. I had
No, I'm
told them
teasing.
that, yeah.
So after your stint at the diocesan offices, what happened?
Well, one of my former volunteers and donors at Catholic Charities approached me one day and said, "Jim, we're looking for," he was on the board of Hope Rehabilitation Services, that's what it was called. "We're looking for a new executive director." And Hope, as you may know, works with people with developmental disabilities, mostly adults. And I had absolutely no experience in working with that group of people. And so I told him, I said, "You know, I don't think that's a good, I'm very flattered, but I don't think that's a good fit for me." And he said, "Well, at least come and visit, just to see what it's like." And more as a favor to him than anything else, I said, okay, I will do that. And Hope had a very strong fundraising program thanks to a woman by the name of Ann Danner, whom I had known. And Ann was also on their board. Well, when I visited one of their sites and saw and met the clients in action, I realized how much I missed that interaction that I had with Catholic Charities. Because when I was at Catholic Charities, I used to go and have lunch with the seniors at the senior centers. I used to use some of the mental health clients as co-speakers at United Way events, so I would interact with some of them. And I just hadn't had that interaction in my job as development director. So I talked with my wife and decided to apply for the job at Hope, and the rest is history. I was at Hope for 5 years. I learned an awful lot. I had a tremendous staff who were incredibly dedicated. We had a union. The union had not had a contract in 6 years when I was hired, and part of the reason I was hired was that I had had previous experience with unions. My staff in San Mateo was unionized. I was a member of the union when I was in San Francisco, and it was the same union. So I was able to, with the help of a key board member, get back into negotiations with the union, and we had a contract within 6 months. Staff was very happy. We went through a training program I did with other CEOs of nonprofits in United Way agencies, where United Way hired this world-class consultant in strategic visioning and planning. And it was the best training I've ever had in my life. And when we were finished with that training, I hired him to help us go through a process at Hope. And it was an 18-month process of strategic planning and visioning, at the end of which we came out with this incredibly powerful strategic plan that included, much to my surprise and the surprise of the board, putting a client on the board.
Terrific.
And as you know, being the mother of a special needs person, we often forget that they have their own dreams.
Yes.
And one of the most powerful lessons we ever learned by why that was a good decision was the year Hope had a wonderful annual event. It was a fundraiser, it was a dinner. And we always invited clients to this dinner. Well, one year we made the mistake of having, just by accident, a clients only table. And there was wine on every table.
Of course.
And the clients became somewhat inebriated. Not seriously, but
A little buzz, huh?
staff immediately, at the end of the dinner, saw what was happening, took care of it. But some of the parents got really upset, and I understood why.
Yeah.
So it came to the board. And the board agreed to have a town hall meeting inviting all the parents to come to discuss, because some parents wanted us to ban the serving of alcoholic beverages at any event where there were clients. We had this town hall meeting, and the parents were split right down the middle. So the next board meeting, Susie's on the board now, we're debating this issue, and Susie puts up her hand. And she was very quiet in most board meetings, as you can imagine. And she said, I'm paraphrasing, she said, you know, she said, whether you like it or not, we're going to drink. And so wouldn't it be better to help us learn how to drink responsibly by having a structure at events where if alcohol is served, we have the proper supervision? Well, it's unanimous on the board.
Absolutely, go Susie.
It was just a wonderful example.
I can imagine.
Anyway,
Yeah.
it's one of my fond memories and stories of why Hope was so special.
Yeah.
It was also at that time when I was, at least I think it was, when John became pastor, John Sandersfeld of Most Holy Trinity. Or maybe he was pastor before then, but anyway, I did some strategic planning with him and his staff there. And then when he became pastor of St. Francis, and I don't remember that year, but I think it was the late 90s, I could be wrong. I actually facilitated for him and his parish, not just his staff, but a parish meeting, a visioning and strategic planning process.
I remember that, because Bernie was there too.
Bernie was there,
Yes,
my wife,
and
yes.
we had, yes, because I facilitated a small group. You had about 18 or 20 small groups.
Right. And as you know, and again, I forget exactly when this happened, Bernie, my wife, was on the staff at St. Francis.
That's right.
In faith formation.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, yeah. But the visioning then, all of your background had to have just been incredibly helpful to Father John.
It was a great experience, and you know, part of what brought me back to working with parishes was what I learned in my seminary formation and priesthood and the experience of the Second Vatican Council. And so being able to use that in a different way was very gratifying.
I can imagine. Then the next stop was Santa Clara?
It was. I was sitting at my desk at Hope, figuring out, okay, what are the next 5 years going to look like? And I got this call out of the blue from the president's office that Father Paul Locatelli wanted to talk with me. And I said, well, what about?
Did you know him?
You know, I knew of him, but I did not know him. I don't think I'd ever met him. And they said, well, we have this position of Vice President of University Relations, and I knew what the position was, and it was primarily fundraising. And I said, gee, I'm flattered, but you know, I don't have the kind of experience that job would require. And Paul got on the line, and I learned, if I learned nothing else in my life, I learned that if a Jesuit invites you to a meeting, you at least accept the invitation. So I said, okay, I'll come over and talk to you about it. Well, in my first meeting with Paul Locatelli, he didn't say a word about fundraising. He talked about his vision for the university and the idea of educating students of competence, conscience, and compassion. And so coming from this articulation of a vision, just, I don't know if he had done his homework about me or what, but he really hooked me. And so again, I went back home, talked with Bernie. We agreed that I would apply because it would get me again back to work within the context of the mission of the church. And much to my surprise, I was selected to be the Vice President of University Relations. And stayed there for 18 years, 16 years full-time and 2 years part-time.
Just easing out.
Retired about a year ago. But I remember going back to the connection with the diocese. I couldn't have been on the job more than 2 weeks, and I get a call from Mateo Sheedy. Jim, this is Mateo. Yeah, Mateo, how you doing? Fine, congratulations on your new job. By the way, we need more scholarships for people from my parish.
Make it happen.
So actually out of that, thanks to Steve Prevet, who at that time was the provost, Steve agreed to create a scholarship for students from Sacred Heart Parish.
And I think it's
that
still going
scholarship
strong.
is still going strong.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And a lot of connections with the university and the diocesan.
Yes.
Offices and
Obviously,
parishes.
the
Yeah.
Pastoral Ministries program, where many graduates are serving in parishes in the diocese. And then later in my career at Santa Clara, when the Jesuit School of Theology became part of the university formally, although it stayed in Berkeley, I was asked specifically to help raise scholarship funds for Jesuit School of Theology students. And it also allowed me, because Paul was great about this, Father Locatelli, to continue to work, and so did Father Michael Eng when he became president, to work with parishes and the diocese in doing some consulting. So over the years, I started facilitating the annual meeting between the bishop and this by this time it was P.J. McGraw, the bishop and his pastors, And then more recently, I've been asked to facilitate some of the clergy days as well.
Do you enjoy that?
I do. You know, it's, especially the last decade or so, I would say, it's been pretty tough sometimes to be a Roman Catholic priest with everything that's been going on. And by and large, the priests of this diocese are incredibly dedicated individuals. And PJ has been tremendous to work with. His pastoral heart is as big as it comes.
It really is. Yeah.
So if I can lend my talents to that a little bit, and I've done some work with a few parishes in terms of their fundraising. Father Gary Thomas out at Sacred Heart in particular.
Because they're doing some renovation, I
They
think,
are,
in
yes,
building.
they're renovating their parish offices,
You know, when you mentioned the Jesuit School in Santa Clara, their summer program, the Instituto,
Yes.
is absolutely wonderful. And many of our Latino and Latina leaders have gone through that program and are doing wonderful work in the parishes.
Yeah.
You know, I do love the fact that the relationship between the university and the diocese is just very strong and very affectionate.
Well, I think that's partly, in great part, why I ended up at Santa Clara, because one of the people on that search committee for the position they hired me for was Sonny Manuel, who was one of the three people who was part of the East Side Project.
Yeah.
He was actually academic vice president at the time, later became provost, was Steve Brevet, a second person. And Dan Gurman was still at the university in campus ministry and the alumni office. So I'm pretty confident that unless that previous relationship had been there, I wouldn't even have gotten that phone call.
Well, you know,
So,
but thank God you did. Yeah. Thinking about our diocese, multiculturalism is a big part of who we are. I have been, particularly when I was working in the office and was privileged to go to several conferences nationally, realizing that the church in the West really can make a contribution, I think, to the church in the United States, particularly in the area of multicultural ministry, worship, and now immigration. I mean, we have dealt with it as a challenge, not as a problem, for years before the rest of the country, has caught up.
I completely agree, and I think, when you have parishes that have liturgy in 3 or 4 languages, the challenge of making that parish I don't know what the right word is, but an integrated and unified, cohesive congregation is extraordinary. And particularly with the fewer number of priests that we have today, and so a stronger reliance on lay ministry. What the diocese has done in training lay ministers, thanks to you and some other people, is unbelievable. And I think a real model for other parts of the church in the world.
Well, we have 2 bishops who believe in lay ministry, who are not threatened by it, who we've been very blessed in this diocese.
Absolutely. And I think we know that the church in California is the church of the future in terms of demographics.
Oh, no question.
It's actually the church of the present in many ways.
In the very near future.
So those are all challenges that I think the diocese can in many ways lead by example and has.
So what are you doing in retirement?
Well, I'm still working with the diocese and with parishes, actually. I've been asked to facilitate the clergy days this coming May.
Oh, good. The San
So
Juan?
yes, so I'm working with Monsignor Celia on that. And I did in May, I did a facilitation of a one-day clergy day, part of which I had a pastor and his parochial vicar have a conversation in front of their peers, which was really very impressive to me. It was Father Rick Radoni and his associate from St. Mary's in Los Gatos. As you know, and it was certainly the case when I was a young parish priest, communication is always a challenge.
Always.
And yet I find that in these clergy gatherings, if you create a safe space where honest dialogue can happen, the fathers are willing to take that on.
Because the fathers have goodwill.
They do.
Yeah, they just get very busy, just a lot of pull on their time. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're doing that.
And then I'm also, this has it's been a very exciting learning experience for me. A year ago, I became a member of the board of directors of the National Catholic Reporter. So
Get a sense of the national church now.
Right. Well, actually, even before that, at Catholic Charities, I got a sense of the national church, because Catholic Charities has a very strong statewide, or did at that time, and national network.
Mm-hmm.
And in my earlier days as a priest, I was secretary of the Priest Senate in San Francisco, which is what we used to call the Priest Council, and was on the board of the National Federation of Priest Councils.
Oh, okay.
So, and I have classmates from my Rome days all over the country. So, but the NCR, to me, is a very important independent voice, Catholic voice for the Church in the United States. And so I'm helping them with their fundraising. That's why they wanted me on the board, because it is challenging for most nonprofit organizations these days.
Well, I'm glad you're doing that.
Thank you.
So, thank you for being with us. This was just wonderful. And
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for the invitation. Bernie and I feel very blessed to have been a part of the diocese for as long as we have.
we are blessed in you and
Both as
contributions that both of you have made.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Hooray for you.
Thanks.